Welcome to the Powerhouse Podcast. Today, I'm excited to have a very special guest, Justin Hochberg. Justin is the CEO of Virtual Brand Group. They delight fans and monetize IP, deliver brand transformation, youth culture marketing, and new revenue development. He's had a very interesting career for decades now, working in Hollywood and production, working in tech, working in streaming. He's got a lot of interesting experiences I'm excited to talk to him about today. So, Justin, thank you so much for being here.
Anthony, what a pleasure. I'm excited to see what you can get out of me.
Oh, well, that's a good starting point. Well, how about we just kick off by maybe you talking about the beginning of your career here? I know you've worked at a lot of interesting places, done a lot of good stuff. And maybe we could start off with what was Justin immediately after college and how did you get into the world of business?
Yeah, well, that's a fascinating question. Well, let me start at the end of the story and work backwards. So
Okay.
right now I run a company called the Virtual Brand Group, and we work with brands at the intersection of storytelling, technology, and commerce. Storytelling, technology, and commerce. And so we've worked with Barbie and Forever 21 and NBC and the TV show The Voice, which is on NBC in 179 other countries. We're working with a movie studio. And we try and help them figure out how to connect with the very elusive youth market, Gen Alpha, Gen Z, young millennials. So how I got my start into this, well, the reason I tell you the end of the story is because it's sort of an outgrowth of the beginning of the story. I have, for over 25 years, worked at the intersection of brands, storytelling, and commerce. I spent 2 decades working in Hollywood, making television shows for Netflix and Disney and NBC. And I've been telling stories for my whole life. So these shows that I make, also, I create the shows, right? There's people who create shows, and then there's people who make the shows. I do both. And I've worked with about 200, 250 different brands across the Fortune 100. But I got my start working for a great brand. I worked for Polo Ralph Lauren in Paris.
Amazing. Well, I feel like there's so many different experiences we can draw from here, but maybe again, we could start from what you're doing right now. I know one of the things that the Virtual Brand Group is focused on is, like you mentioned, storytelling, technology, commerce. And if we're talking about young audiences, let's say Gen Z, Gen Alpha, one of the things I've seen a lot, and I've seen you post about it on LinkedIn, is the sort of realm of gaming and metaverse and virtual experiences here. I've seen more and more every day. A new brand is talking about a Roblox experience, a Fortnite experience, the sandbox. And these are things where maybe 10 years ago that would have seemed maybe more far-fetched or maybe more experimental for a brand to do. Now it seems to be becoming more common. So I'd love to get your take on how that's been developing.
Yeah, well, I think there is a long arc of new things being adopted by young people who have time, money, curiosity, that old people don't embrace or understand. And that probably goes back to the wheel, to music, to television, to the internet, to social media. Keep going, right? Whatever the next thing is. And so it's no shock to me, or most people who observe the arc of history, that, there's this new thing, whatever the new thing is. Now we call it social gaming, Roblox, Fortnite, maybe call it 3D worlds. And it's first adopted by young people who have time and curiosity. And over time, when lots of young people aggregate, what's the first thing that brands do? They're like, ooh, they're over here, let's go there. So it makes perfect sense to me.
Well, I think, how do you see that evolving from maybe just like, I think back to some of the first like activations I saw on something like the sandbox or Roblox a few years ago. It seemed to me kind of more like maybe cool PR, because there's a thing where, when a brand is approaching something new, sometimes the reason they do it just to be like, oh, we're cool, we're innovative, right? And then as the sort of like adoption curve changes, maybe brands start taking more seriously. I remember I started Facebook many years ago when it was still a new, cool thing, but now it's like a central part of any marketing budget. Now I'm seeing things like, one thing that particularly inspired me was, I don't know if you saw the Fenty Rihanna Roblox experience, where it's obviously a game, but it also turned into kind of a product development experience where they picked a specific product that people had voted on in Roblox, and now they've released it as a physical product. So it's not just like a cool one-off thing, but it's clearly part of their at least strategy, product development. And I see that going even further. Like, what is the evolution you see in terms of how brands are taking more seriously, let's say, a gaming experience from just PR, it's something that actually impacts their bottom line? Or how do you think it impacts their bottom line now?
Yeah. Well, first, I think I'll make a couple points. One is, who cares about games? It's nobody woke up who runs a company, whether it's Fenty, a movie studio, um, a consumer packaged good that sells cookies. Nobody woke up and to say, you know what we need to do? I know this cookie thing is great, but we really want to make games. In fact, they woke up this morning and said, it'd be great if I didn't have to do something that I have zero knowledge of and is a total pain. That's what would be great. But unfortunately, that's not the world we live in. And so what I often counsel brands on is you make your product. If this other thing over here, call it whatever you want. Today, you want to call it Roblox and Fortnite, social games. Yesterday, maybe you wanted to call it Snapchat. Before that, you wanted to call it YouTube and Facebook. Before that, you wanted to call it cable TV, whatever you want to call it. If somebody can show you how to use that as a mechanism, then that's valuable. And the reason why I stress that is because too many brands wake up and think, oh, I'm going to be a TikTok star, or we're going to have we're going to be a game making company. You're not. So stop trying to be that. Just figure out how you can partner with someone, whether it's us or one of my colleagues, that can help you figure out how to take advantage of this new channel that reaches consumers, right? And that's what you're alluding to is a lot of people get in early because it's cool and they think, oh, and it's not cool. Brands in generally are very uncool. What happens over time is people go from that's kind of PR to that's cool marketing to, oh, we should kind of use this to run a business, which is what the internet is and what social media is, what AI will be, et cetera.
And I think you touched on one of the latest hype things. That's a topic I see discussed a lot, AI. And I think there's a whole sort of arc there where, I think that if you look over the last couple of years, there was a massive amount of hype with regards to AI. Startups getting funded. It seemed like at one point Gen AI was going to obviate, make obsolete 90% of the media entertainment industry, which is definitely, I'd say, overstated, but not completely like off base in the long term. And then now, and recording right now in August 2024, it seems like there's a lot of talk about AI being at least a hype bubble, or maybe at least overfunded, overhyped, given the economic conditions. And I think to myself, that's something where, considering your career when it comes to Hollywood, when it comes to entertainment, you've probably seen technologies go up and down. What from your vantage point, because maybe a brand might be asking you for advice, like, "Hey, Justin, what do I do with AI? How do I deal with that?" What is the sort of hype of AI that you think may be overstated, and what are the most maybe tangible, practical elements of it that you think a brand needs to take into consideration? Maybe we could talk about brands, but also like Hollywood more broadly in entertainment and media.
So I don't think AI is a hype, and I don't think the metaverse is a hype, and I don't think the internet was a hype. I think I think when people say it's a hype, it means they had an outsized expectation without really an understanding of how it was going to be used. I mean, I don't know how many of your listeners will remember this, but I worked at Silicon Valley for Microsoft in the late 90s and early 2000s. And in 2001, March, the internet bubble burst, quote unquote, on the stock market. And people literally said, oh, I guess the internet is not a thing, right? It's not about, so what I think that is about is people realizing the thing they thought it was going to be used for may not be the way they thought it was going to be used. But that doesn't mean that underlying technology isn't valuable or doing a lot of stuff, because the average consumer sees just about the tip of the iceberg. So I'll give you a great example of AI not being a hype. My father is 91 years old, very fluid, lucid, mobile. Shout out to you, Ed. And I was with him last month and I said, Dad, I know you love the internet. Let me show you ChatGPT. And he's like, I don't want a new thing. I'm too old for a new thing. Now he's pretty fluid with stuff, right? Maybe too fluid, texts a lot. I said, but you're going to love this. And I showed him ChatGPT and he's like, well, this is great. I don't have to go through Google rankings anymore. Instead of searching for like, what's the best, I don't know, car repair shop near me and getting 20 listings he has to click through, he gets a synopsis of like exactly what to do. So that's a small use case. But if a 91-year-old is using it like that, that tells me there's a lot of value to unlock.
Can we talk about then how AI is applied to, let's say, the entertainment industry? Because I know in the last, the Hollywood strikes and the sort of negotiations between the studios and different streaming platforms, et cetera, there's a lot of worry about AI. I know you've been involved in, whether directly or indirectly, the creation, production, writing of a
Yeah.
lot of different shows and TV
Yeah.
formats, et cetera. Where is the biggest sort of threat for someone involved in that production process? Is it the people in the editing part and the writers? Is it the producers? How should someone, if they're working more on the production side of things and let's say getting like a show off the ground, how can AI be helpful for them versus who are the folks maybe should be worried about how that could affect their job, or at least what their expectations of a job should be moving forward?
Yeah, everyone, literally everyone.
Everyone.
Um,
Okay.
Kara Swisher, who is a renowned tech analyst, you probably know Anthony, but if, in case your listeners don't, Kara Swisher is a renowned tech analyst, Wall Street Journal for many years, has a wonderful podcast. Said she's also got a great book that came out this summer called Burn Book. Highly recommend it. I think she said at some point earlier in her career when she was sort of uncovering the internet, and that anything that can be digitized will be. Anything that can be will be. And I think that proves true whether we like it or not. And a lot of people don't like it. And I'm very empathetic to that. Hollywood has a lot of things that can be digitized. So, a simple thing was we used to edit TV shows or film with literally film. And you'd have to, we've all seen like there's a strip of film and then you cut it. And I mean, who does that, right? Now, then when you digitally edit film, you can, do a ton of things, just like we all digitally edit presentations or on our iPhone. Same thing here. So I think artificial intelligence is making anything that can be, even things I couldn't even imagine, will be digitized or used with AI. That doesn't mean there won't be other jobs or different jobs, kind of just like the music industry collapsed with streaming media, but it still exists 20 years later. But right now it's incredibly hard because, the industry is going through a big transformation.
We're saying this on the eve of, I think it was today or yesterday, I read that Axios, which is maybe considered like a fairly modern new media company, did a bunch of layoffs, and the CEO like mentioned the sort of macro trends with regards to technology and sort of how a media brand exists now versus, differently. Does that imply then that, let's say, if you are at a studio right now, a traditional Hollywood studio, to use that like, quotation marks, will the size of that studio from, like, let's say, an employment perspective need to necessarily cut down? I don't know by how much, but like in the future, because, you started your career at a time when I'm sure, technology's always been a part of Hollywood, but
Sure.
maybe the makeup of a studio is different when you started versus now. Is that something where in the future, let's say if you're 20 years old today and someone was in love with the idea of working at a Hollywood studio, how should their expectations change versus when you started in Hollywood?
Well, I think that the industry is vastly different than even just 5 or 10 years ago, much less 30 or 40 years ago from a lot of people. And I would say that, the need to be at a location like the studio, which really, what is a studio? A studio is a aggregator of talent and capital that distributes content. That's what they do, right? Talent comes in, ideas, directors, actors in. Capital funds those things. They make a product, movie, TV show, and then they distribute it. Okay. So finding talent is a lot easier than it ever was, right? Before. Discovering talent, being discovered, totally different than it was 25 years ago. Capital is capital. Everybody can have it. Mr. Beast has it, and so does a movie studio. There's a lot of funds. There's a lot of ways to get capital. And distribution is now largely digital, right? People are going to less movies. Behavior patterns have shifted during the pandemic. We're now watching, Netflix, and at our home, you can get a 50-inch TV set for $400. So that's a really disrupted business. So my answer to your question about young people is, unless you have a passion for working on like really long form content, like a traditional movie, and you really want to go through the sort of gauntlet to do that, that's not a great use of, of a place to be when you're starting out, because it's not a growing industry. It's a contracting industry.
Now, I want to go down the sort of walk down memory lane of how you've seen Hollywood change. But before I do that, maybe let's double down a bit more on virtual brand groups. So Maybe could you mention some of the projects that you've worked on at the company that you're most proud of? Maybe some stuff that's up and coming, stuff you're most excited about that the company's been doing so far.
Yeah. Well, I think you mentioned something earlier, which was can these virtual spaces like Roblox and Fortnite become actually like what value, what do we say is what enterprise value can they create? So you have top of funnel, which is sort of like, oh, awareness and then maybe engagement. That's, what you do maybe through TikTok or Facebook or even TV ads. But what's the bottom of the funnel, right? Because all this neat innovation has to get paid for somehow, right? So one of the things that we are very well known for, and I'm glad you mentioned the Fenty example, is about a year and a half before Fenty came out, we launched the third brand ever on Roblox. This is in 2021. And it was Forever 21, which is owned by the Authentic Brand Group, fantastic partner that owns about 50 different iconic brands from Muhammad Ali's estate to Brooks Brothers and Reebok, et cetera. And we created this experience on Roblox and we decided to become retailers. So we created virtual fashion. We leaned very heavy into that at a time when brands weren't doing that yet. And one of our items became so successful on Roblox. It was selling like 15,000 units a day. And I just paused there for a second because 15,000 units a day, I mean, unless you're Amazon, that's pretty much unheard of. Of course, it's a digital item. So the cost to make it and the cost to sell every new one is really almost nothing. But it became so successful that Forever 21 had the foresight, led by their CMO, to create a physical line of the virtual line. So taking what we created there, building it for their stores and for the physical e-commerce, and not only taking the product, but expanding the line. So, and here is an example of the ubiquitous Forever Black beanie that was featured on Netflix and sold across Forever 21. And not only did they make a hat, but sweatpants, sweatshirts, pink, different colors, etc. Massive success. And of course, a lot of top of the funnel, brand awareness, innovation, a lot of bottom of the funnel. It's in store, sold out, very successful. So that's something we're really well known for. And I think that represents the idea of figuring out how a brand expresses himself in an authentic way in a new space that with a new type of demographic, leaning into that type of group of people's consumer behavior pattern, and then building off of that into their current core business.
That's a fantastic example. I remember it reminds me of a couple of others. Like I think Adidas and Gucci both had Roblox experiences where they ended up selling like massive amounts of these digital items. And I think it's very likely, I don't know what stage we are in terms of this evolution, that any retailer, fashion brand in particular, will have a physical digital experience that seems like it makes sense. Considering the fact, you're talking to these brands all the time, whether it's a Forever 21 or Fenty or companies like that,
Yeah.
is this still a thing where maybe playing not devil's advocate for a second, but if you were to survey the CMOs of every major fashion brand, is this still like a hard sell for someone in terms of like Roblox, Fortnite experience? Is it to the point now where 99% of these CMOs and CEOs get it, or is it still kind of an emerging part of the market for retail and fashion that
Yeah.
still has a way to go before breaking into like the mainstream awareness?
It's a great question. I guess I would always say, no matter what, is there's generally a bell curve of, people are first movers, early movers over here, the bulk of people, and then there's people who are generally not going to get there or going to get there slower. And so in the last 3 years, I've observed a lot more people being on the right side of the graph. But more importantly than the right side, I've seen a lot of people move from the left side to the middle, right? It's from, I don't know this, I don't want to know this, to, interesting. I think for context, we're still really early days, and I can give you the math behind that, which is as I said, we were the third brand on Roblox. I think by the end of this year, I'm guessing there'll probably have been 600-700 brands that will have activated on Roblox, which is a lot more than 3. But if you think of the number of brands that are on TikTok or Facebook, it's a minuscule amount. And so I think there's a group of people that have been there and want to do better. So that's good for us. There's a people who are looking at how it was going to work out and want to be there. That's good for us. And that's where we really focus.
No, and that does seem like a natural sort of distribution. I mean, I started writing a TikTok marketing newsletter 4 years ago and was talking about brands activating on TikTok then. And now, even though I feel like maybe at least in terms of my bubble of my friends, my colleagues, TikTok's an obvious marketing channel. I know that's not necessarily the case for everyone in marketing and advertising. It still might be a foreign or new thing. Now,
Yeah.
I'm really interested, we talk here about what we're essentially talking about are different formats and media for storytelling, right? And
Right.
going back to
Yeah.
that great line you mentioned earlier, storytelling, technology, and commerce. I'm just really fascinated to hear more about your career. You've worked at some really interesting places, Microsoft, Saturn Awards. You've done a lot of, TV production, film,
Yes.
etc. Maybe just like an open-ended question here. Like, could you tell us maybe about some of the projects that you're most like proud of from throughout your career? And I'm particularly interested in putting together like the IP and the content that you've worked on in your career.
Yeah. Well, I think, let's see. I think the Forever 21 example is a really great thing. I mean, let me back up. I have specialized in new markets and new use cases since I left college. From my college career, I was in Paris for 2 years. I then went to Prague for 3 years. I was at Silicon Valley and Redmond for 5 years after business school. The dawn of reality TV, and early in this virtual space. And so that's my sort of zone, is early innovation and wrangling down the market, brand, product fit. A couple of things that I love besides the Forever 21 example is going to the other end, not that's relevant these days, is I helped develop a TV show that became pretty famous on NBC because it was the number one show, and it also featured a guy named Donald Trump. And I'm talking about The Apprentice. And I say that as a creative statement, not as a political statement. So we'll just keep it on that level, if you don't mind, Anthony. And one of the reasons I really thrived and enjoyed that was because it was the perfect mix of everything I just actually told you around the other stories, which is this was a nascent industry. It was like 2 years old, reality TV. It was a format that lent itself towards innovation. So if you think about like what reality TV can be, is you can use real people and do real products in a way you can't do with scripted, right? It just feels more organic. In fact, that's the way TV started, with brands sponsoring game shows like, you know, soap operas are called soap operas because they're sponsored by soap companies. So the thing that was most interesting was less about the format, the creative, which is awesome, but I had the innovation that said, hey, why don't we put brands in the show? Why don't we make brands part of the show? And at that time, the creator of the show, a guy named Mark Burnett, who's very talented, he had done Survivor and he's done many shows. He said to me, and that fit my background because I was an MBA and I had just come from Microsoft and I had never worked in TV. And I said, look, you've got NBC and it's a business show. Let's have them do businesses. And he literally looked at me and goes, that's the dumbest idea I've ever heard. Don't do that. Literally. Now, I don't know that if you interviewed him, he would ever say that, and that's okay. But that is the truth. And I said, okay. And I went off and I just did it. And I came back and that became a $350 million business because we figured out, and I stress this, how to take brands, whether they were exciting ones like fashion or jets or champagne, or more everyday brands like staples, pens, pencils, etc. And we figured out how to tell really compelling stories using this new technology, i.e. reality TV, and connected it through just really good gamification. Like, how do you create a game? And it not only was top of funnel exciting because people watch the show, but we created a product for Staples on this TV show. And the task was make a desktop organizer for Trump because he's got a messy desk. Not shocking if you've ever observed him. And the teams made it, and Staples put it in stores, and we sold 698,000 units in 30 days. That's $22 million at retail. So that's pretty exciting.
Justin, you're touching on a topic I am fascinated by. I actually very recently read a book called Billion Dollar Game. You might have heard of it. It talks about the story of John DeMol putting together Big Brother. I think Mark Burnett's featured in it. I don't personally know them like you do, but I'm always very interested in the topic. I wonder, in today's world, because we're talking about, The Apprentice came out, I think, 10, 15 years ago.
20
I'm
years
curious
ago.
to know, really? Okay. So
Yeah.
I'm curious about the next generation of reality shows. Because obviously, I mean, just top of mind to me right now, like Love Island's really big right now. The formats,
Yeah.
whether we're talking about dating or whatever, or, like Shark Tank, that kind of stuff, they're still, up and going. And I'm curious about where the next generation of reality content comes from, because an area that I'm personally very interested in is the creator economy and the encompassing talent, influencers. Mr. Beast has an Amazon show now, even though there's been
Oh
some
yeah.
controversy recently. I follow the Sidemen here in the UK. They've got their own kind of reality shows. Drewski, pretty big famous comedian, has
Yeah.
got his own sort of half serious, half joking show. And I wonder that in the future, do you think that where will the next generation of IP come from when it comes to, let's say, reality TV? Because where I see a lot of creativity, and of course, this is not to discount the major networks or streaming platforms, but I think there's kind of like a semi grassroots, bottoms up content sort of growth that you're seeing from these creators and influencers. Maybe the next big shows will come from a
Yeah.
YouTuber that currently does not have a relationship with the big network. What's your take on that?
Well, look, I think I would never say that ideas usually generate from networks, right? Like they certainly are creative people, but they're not creating the shows, right? The people that independent creators are typically, whether it's John DeMol, Mark Burnett, whether it's Shonda Rhimes on the scripted side, whether it's Steven Spielberg on the feature side, right? Or any of the writers. Was a wonderful writer I went to high school with named Zach Penn. He wrote Free Guy and Ready Player One. So that's usually where ideas come from. So where do those people get ideas from? Well, those people get ideas from just every place. Like it's life, it's TikTok, it's a book, it's an experience that you had, it's somebody else's experience that they had. One of the things that, obviously, so we're constantly hunting for new trends, things that feel legitimate, that have happened already. So, where do people typically get stuff from? I think TikTok trends are interesting. I think virtual spaces like Roblox and Fortnite are fantastic because they have people playing and interacting. They're social platforms, right? They're much more like Survivor or Love Island than they are like an Atari video game from 30 years ago.
No, I mean, I can really hear the passion in your voice, Justin, about, the world of, let's say, entertainment, content, media.
Yeah.
And I know there's so many things here that we're kind of just like excitedly looking into the future to see how these things will evolve, which is sometimes beyond our ability to predict the future. But
Yeah.
I love to know, like, where does your interest in, I guess, media entertainment come from? Did you grow up just wanting to get into this space? Did it come from, I don't know, like getting struck by a lightning bolt in college, realizing this is what I want to do? I love to know just like where your passion comes from.
That's a curious and interesting question. I appreciate that a lot. I think it was my father was an intrinsic storyteller. He always told stories. In fact, I can remember a number of them right now. Second shout out to dad. So I think that's where I always got interested in that. And then I think, it's incremental, right? I didn't have a lightning bolt. I was always curious and I liked new things, new places. When I graduated college, I deferred law school and I got up and I just packed my bags and I moved to Paris without having a job or knowing anybody. And that's hard. I spoke French and Italian, but still I wasn't familiar with it. So new always excites me and storytelling always excites me. And over the time, that sort of led me to interesting places. And even though when I was in Prague, I built a telecom company that's not entertainment, it was still telling a story, right? To me, it was, hey, how do I convince people to buy this thing or do this thing that they just don't do? To me, literally, I thought about it the other day, and this is the first time I've ever publicly disclosed this. I thought about my day. I try and think methodically. What do I want to, what's my intention today? What do I care about? What will be impactful and what's not impactful? And I realized that I spend all of my day just only doing two things. It looks different, but it's literally just doing two things: coming up with ideas and figuring out how to communicate those ideas to some end result. So, hey, we should build a Roblox experience for, I don't know, July 4th, because that's a huge holiday. Okay, that's an idea. Well, how am I going to communicate that? What do I need to do that? What do I want getting done? Who do I need to go to sell that in? Or is that people, is it consumers, is it brands? And so that's just what to quote Cobra Kai, shout out to John Hurwitz, who wrote it, who I love and think dearly. I've been waxing on and waxing off for a long time doing the same thing.
Fantastic reference right there. No, Justin, I love how, you mentioned some of your experiences at a global level. We're talking about Paris, we're talking about just, all around the world. I think one of the trends that I'm seeing as the world kind of globalizes is the
Yeah.
sort of dispersion, distribution of content just across the world. I know like Netflix, for example, is investing a lot in foreign language features, and that's
Yeah.
not just one country, but all over. We're talking about India, we're talking about Brazil, talking about Korea. I'd say maybe Korea is the most obvious sort of like wave of whether we're talking about K-pop being incredibly
Yeah.
popular. Parasite, K dramas, K beauty, which, I would imagine like if you were in the Hollywood in the 80s, the idea of Korean dramas no one would even care about. What's your take on, I guess, the sort of distribution of the origination of content, right? Because if people in Korea and India or whatever have more of a democratized view to getting the content out there, does that
Yeah.
mean that we're going to be living in a world where content is just naturally more and more globalized and international?
Well, I think the answer is we already are. I think where it is less than so is where it's been aggregated and like in places like Hollywood, right? I mean, Hollywood is a uniquely American and not even really American. It's America and it's California and it's one city, right? Like if you think about venture capital as an example, sure, Silicon Valley may be the most famous in America, but there's a lot of money flowing from a lot of places in the United States. If you think about Hollywood, how many places can you name up till recently that actually made movies or had infrastructure to make movies? And infrastructure means the people, the physical things you need, the skill set, right? Today, New York, Georgia, LA, but like it's pretty aggregated. So content should be, I mean, America is a relatively small market compared to the rest of the world. So the fact that good ideas are now flowing in much faster ways, back to Kara Swisher, is, there's a reason why Korean formats and ideas can come through now, because the barrier to getting in front of not a Korean audience, but a global audience does not run through one programming executive sitting here in Hollywood that says, nah, nobody's going to watch Asian people. I mean, that's literally what they said before they made the movie Crazy Rich Asians. It's like, no, that's not, people don't watch Asian. I was like, who says stuff like that? It's so ridiculous.
Well, I guess I think it's a good thing now that we have more access to, let's say, global content, global
Yeah,
talent. And I remember I was reading an article recently, I think it was in The Economist, talking about how now that Netflix is bidding on sports rights, depending on how
yeah,
deep they want to go in there, if you think about it, their sort of distribution network is arguably one of the biggest and most global. So if they actually, let's say, if
sure.
Netflix hypothetically owned the rights to broadcast all the NFL games, then that would actually probably reach more people versus if it's going to a traditional network. I see this like sports is probably one of the ways that this sort of content will be getting more international and diverse, but it kind of
Uh-huh.
sits across every type of content.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think also what one thing that's very interesting to me is, we talk about soap operas, right? I think it was
Uh-huh.
P&G that first came up with that idea or whatever derivative of P&G back then. I see a lot of companies like announcing that they're creating their own in-house production companies. And I don't know if
Uh-huh.
that's a thing where it's like just a business cycle, because I know that it's not like this is only for the first time ever that these companies
Sure.
have come up with production companies. But I was reading in the last like 6 months, I think it was Starbucks, I think it was ABI have set up production companies.
Nike has one.
Nike has one. Is
LVMH has one.
exact yes, that was a fairly new one, right? In the last 6 months. Is this something that, from your experience working with brands over like many decades now, is it really new, or is it maybe just the latest derivative version of what's already been happening for, I guess, decades since soap operas?
Yeah. Well, I think the answer to this short-term question is it new? It is relatively new that companies are really investing in doing that stuff. That has happened off and on in various different incarnations over a long time. Budweiser had one about 10 years ago. I mean, stuff. It's still, even though it's new, it's still not at scale. I mean, you just named 4 or 5 companies. I can't name 4 or 5 other companies. Now, there probably are, but I can't name 40 or 50 other companies, right? So 4 companies does not really make a trend. The truth of the matter is the reason why companies used to sponsor entire shows at the advent of TV was because it was less expensive. You could be one brand and pay for a whole thing. Now, if you want to sponsor a TV show, it could be, $5 to $50 million for a show, right? You just don't do that for an hour of TV. It's not worth it. But there is a thing now because content has been democratized. Everybody, and this is important, everybody has now been trained for the last decade plus to be a storyteller. Everybody curates their life, what I post on Instagram, what filter I use, what tags I use. Even if you're not an influencer, you're still curating. You're still familiar with music, edits, filters, cuts, This is the language we all speak. And so if you think about everybody doing that, it seems logical to me that brands would want more control over how they express themselves to their consumers or fans. And that to me is the outgrowth of the rise in this like branded content studios.
And I think that will continue to increase. I mean, I'm seeing whether it's very direct product integrations or whether it's more just like longer form branded content series. I think that will just increase because you see this like real convergence, right? Like
Right.
if someone like LeBron James is going to create his own show like The Shop, and then some other random long tail creators creating their own kind of show, if Budweiser's doing their own version of it, if you have Netflix doing it, if you have maybe a traditional network doing it, if you have the BBC doing it, all of that will kind of blend together because I think the sort of traditional barriers that separated them make less and less sense to a younger audience, kind of bringing it full circle where, you know, you were talking about, let's say with Virtual Brand Group, experiences, particularly towards younger audiences. And I think if I was talking to a 13-year-old right now, they wouldn't necessarily delineate between, oh, that came from the BBC, that came from LeBron, that came from Budweiser. It's just all content to them. It's this interesting sort of whirlwind right now. Now, I'd love to know, I mean, there's so many topics in the sort of space that you operate in across media, entertainment, brands, virtual experiences. And we could obviously talk about 100 different topics here, but are there certain areas that you're probably most excited about, whether it's topics or companies or just general trends that maybe we haven't mentioned yet that you're up at night thinking about very intensely or at least something like that?
Yeah, I think thankfully we talked about the things that I'm most interested in, which are, brands, storytelling, and ways to create commerce from it. I mean, as I said before, I am a creature of habit, right? I've been doing some version of this. It might have looked different. I mean, if you said, oh, what's reality TV having, in connection with, Fortnite or Roblox, you might not see it. But when you abstract the layers, so I would say that the thing that I'm always excited about is like, I never thought about Fortnite or Roblox 4 years ago. And so now 4 years later, I'm deep in this. So the question becomes, what's the next thing? And when is the next thing coming? And I don't know that until I see it, but I know that it is coming. And I've always enjoyed being in the middle of that.
Justin, I appreciate you taking the time and just kind of wrapping up now. I'd love to just end with maybe some last final questions here. One being, where can people find you on website, LinkedIn, whatever? Yeah. And then the last question being, do you have any last message or thought for the audience, whether it's someone listening to this who's just interested in your topics, whether it's a brand, just any sort of final thoughts. But yeah, just those last two questions right there.
Yeah, sure. So probably the best place to both find me and see if you like what you hear more of it is on LinkedIn, because I'm constantly there connecting with my colleagues and brands, sharing and spotlighting people's successes, whether they're mine or other people we work with in the industry. So it's Justin Hochberg, LinkedIn. Of course, we have a website, Virtual Brand Group. I guess what I would say is something that is not what we talked about, but I do like is I'm really into reading long form these days, books, as opposed to just scanning information on the internet, which I used to do. I always do. And I haven't read books in a long time. And one of the books I want to highlight, because I think about when I think one of the things you've asked smartly is like, how do you think about thinking about these things, right? Is like, that's the question, right? Because these things are going to evolve. I don't know what the next thing is. Is it AI? Is it interactive TV? Whatever it is. But how do you think about thinking about these things? And one of the greatest books I just recently read, so I'm going to shout it out, is a book by David Brooks, who's a New York Times columnist, and it's How to Know Someone. And it is a remarkable book, and I have to pay credit. It was on Bill Gates' summer reading list. And what caught my attention is Bill Gates said, this book changed the way I communicate with people. And I thought to myself, well, if it works for him, I might be willing to give it a shot. And I have to say, I actually did a book club with one of my best friends here in LA, who's a corporate lawyer, and we read it together and talked about it, and it was transformational. And so I think anybody's looking to sort of connect with people, whether you're in sales or marketing or just working with people, this is an excellent way to think about how to think about things.
Fantastic closing statement. Justin, really appreciate it. Thank you for taking the time.
Thanks, Anthony. This has been a joy, and have a beautiful day.
Thank you. You too.